He didn't inherit an empire. He wasn't born into privilege, wealth, or even comfort. He was born into limits, the kind that either crush a man's ambition or ignite it. On the rough, wind-beaten shores of Staten Island, a 16-year-old boy looked out at the water and saw something no one else did: freedom. The soil of his family's farm was poor, dry, and unyielding, a symbol of small life. But the waves, the tides, and the ships that cut across the harbor whispered of movement, of power, of destiny. Cornelius Vanderbilt, a name that would one day shake Wall Street and rewrite American wealth, began his story with a single decision: to take control of his own fate. He went to his mother, a stern and practical woman, and asked to borrow $100, a massive sum for their humble means. Not to buy land, not to build a home, but to buy a periauger, a small, two-masted sailing vessel. His offer to her was simple. He would work her fields day after day until the debt was repaid. Then he would be free to pursue his enterprise. It wasn't just a boy's request. It was a contract, a deal built on vision, not inheritance. And in that moment, the pattern of his life was set: leverage, labor, and unbreakable conviction. When Vanderbilt took command of that small boat, he didn't just start a ferry business. He declared sovereignty over his first territory: the water itself. Each passenger, each trip, each coin earned from those Staten Island crossings was another brick in the foundation of an empire. He learned that power doesn't come from what you're given. It comes from what you dare to take responsibility for. That the true capital of any empire builder isn't money, it's willpower. And as the young sailor cut through the waters of New York Harbor, perhaps he already knew that this was just the beginning. The first tide of a life that would rise to rule the seas, the rails, and eventually the nation's economy itself. Because every empire begins the same way, with one person who refuses to stay on shore. Competition was never enough for Cornelius Vanderbilt. He didn't want to win fairly. He wanted to erase the opposition. For him, business wasn't a polite game of profit. It was a war for survival, fought on the waters of the American frontier. When the steamboat operators on the Raritan River formed their monopoly, they thought they could bury a young, uneducated ferryman from Staten Island. They had money, they had influence. They had the arrogance that comes from thinking power can't be challenged. Vanderbilt looked at them and saw something else: a stagnant system waiting to be destroyed. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't beg for inclusion. He built his own line and went straight for their jugular: the price. He dropped fares to zero. The newspapers called it madness. His competitors laughed until the crowds began to pour onto his boats. The rich men on shore couldn't understand how he was surviving. The secret was simple. Vanderbilt was selling bar tickets, not boat tickets. He made his profit in whiskey and beer while his passengers rode for free. Every drink poured was a strike against the empire of his rivals. Every wave that hit their docks was another blow to their illusion of control. He wasn't trying to coexist with the old system. He was trying to break it. He knew that the only way to dominate a market was to make the current one impossible to sustain. And when the monopoly finally broke, when those proud men realized they couldn't last another month, they came to him, desperate to buy their peace. Vanderbilt walked away not as a loser but as a conqueror, paid handsomely by the very men who once sought to destroy him. This was his art, the art of creative destruction. To him, chaos wasn't something to avoid. It was a weapon. He learned that disruption is not recklessness, it's strategy sharpened into a blade. Because in business, the man who can suffer low anger, fight harder, and think colder, always owns the battlefield. And as Vanderbilt watched his defeated enemies fade into history, a question burned quietly in his mind, the same one that would guide his rise for decades to come. If I can crush kings on water, what's stopping me from ruling the land? Cornelius Vanderbilt didn't seek validation. He sought control. The press hated him, rivals cursed him, and even politicians feared him. But none of it mattered. Vanderbilt had discovered one of the darkest truths about power: that true control demands emotional detachment. He operated with a kind of terrifying independence, the kind that made ordinary men uncomfortable. Once, when asked if he feared the law, he smirked and said, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power? It wasn't a boast. It was a philosophy. In Vanderbilt's world, the law was a set of rules written by men, and men could be bought, persuaded, or crushed. He didn't see morality as a compass. He saw it as an obstacle. There's a famous story told by one of his associates. When a group of investors confronted him over a ruthless business move, they tried appealing to his conscience. Vanderbilt didn't raise his voice. He simply stared at them in silence, an unflinching, cold gaze that said everything. They left the room without another word. That was his genius. He didn't waste energy defending himself. He understood that morality, reputation, and approval were currencies for the powerless. His currency was dominance. To him, public opinion was like the wind. It shifted, it howled, but it could be harnessed if you understood its direction. Vanderbilt never tried to be loved. He aimed to be inevitable. The people could hate him, the papers could slander him, but they still had to ride his ferries, ship their goods on his vessels, and later cross his railroads. That was the essence of his strategy: build systems so essential that society itself can't function without you. The public be damned mindset wasn't cruelty. It was strategic isolation. He detached himself from the noise, from the politics of popularity, and focused solely on command. Because he knew that to truly change a game, you must stop seeking approval from its players. He was rewriting the rules while others argued about fairness. And in that ruthless silence, Vanderbilt proved a principle that still echoes through every boardroom and empire today. Power doesn't ask for permission. It simply acts. But beneath that cold exterior, a new hunger was forming. The seas were no longer enough. His empire on water had made him rich, but his mind had already drifted inland toward a far greater conquest, the iron veins of America itself. Most men spend their lives defending what they've built. Cornelius Vanderbilt did the opposite. He burned his own kingdom to build a bigger one. At the height of his steamship empire, he had everything. Wealth that rivaled nations, power that shaped markets, a reputation that made rivals tremble. By all accounts, he could have spent the rest of his life coasting on that success, wrapped in luxury and legacy. But Vanderbilt was not a man who looked backward. He was 70 years old when he saw it, the slow, silent decay of his greatest triumph. Steamships had conquered the water, but steel rails were beginning to conquer the land. America's destiny was shifting. The Iron Horse was rewriting commerce, movement, and time itself. Most men his age would have denied it, dismissed it, or tried to fight it. Vanderbilt did something far more radical. He surrendered to progress before it defeated him. One by one, he sold off his beloved ships, the very vessels that had built his name and fortune. To his peers, it looked like madness. To him, it was evolution. Every dollar he pulled from the water, he poured into the rails. He wasn't just investing in a business. He was betting his entire identity on a new world. Imagine it, an old sailor, hardened by decades at sea, walking into the smoke-filled, cutthroat world of railroad barons as a newcomer. The risks were enormous. His enemies whispered that he'd lost his mind, but Vanderbilt had learned something few men ever do. Clinging to success is the fastest path to extinction. He understood that the only way to survive change is to lead it, and that sometimes, to keep winning, you must destroy your own past victories. It takes more than intelligence to do that. It takes courage. The kind that only exists in people who see the world not as it is, but as it's becoming. As he signed the last sale of his ships, Vanderbilt didn't mourn what he had built. He was already thinking about the next empire, the rails that would connect a young, restless nation and make him, once again, its undisputed master. And so the Commodore of the Seas became the general of the rails. Because the truly powerful never protect the past, they build the future. They thought the old sailor was finished, a relic from another age, a man too old, too slow, too sentimental to survive in the ruthless world of Wall Street. The railroad elite, the old money of New York, looked at Cornelius Vanderbilt and saw prey. What they didn't see was the predator beneath the surface, sharpening his instincts for one last decisive war. The battleground was the Harlem River Railroad, Vanderbilt's new venture. His rivals saw it as fragile, unprofitable, a perfect target. So they launched what was known in those days as a bear raid, They began shorting Harlem stock, flooding the market with sell orders they didn't own, betting that the price would collapse and Vanderbilt's railroad would crumble under the pressure. But Vanderbilt wasn't a man easily cornered. He understood the market the way a sailor understands the sea, its tides, its tempests, and its hidden currents. And when the storm came, he didn't flinch. Quietly, methodically, he began to buy. Every share they sold short, he bought. Every rumor they spread, he absorbed with silence, and every dollar they risked became a brick in the wall of their own destruction. The speculators didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. They had sold what they did not possess, and the only man who owned the shares they needed was Vanderbilt himself. As the price began to rise, panic spread like wildfire across the trading floor. The very men who had plotted his downfall were now fighting each other to cover their positions. The old sea captain watched it unfold like a master strategist, his revenge delivered not with anger but precision. The stock soared, and those who had mocked him were ruined. Vanderbilt made millions, but the money wasn't the point. It was the principle. He had turned their arrogance into his profit, their conspiracy into his coronation. The message was unmistakable. Power belongs to the one who sees further, thinks colder, and acts faster. Vanderbilt's triumph over the bear raid was more than a financial victory. It was psychological domination. He had proven that information and conviction, when wielded with patience and control, can shatter even the mightiest opponents. From that moment, Wall Street never underestimated him again. The sailor had conquered the sea, and now he had conquered the market. But his empire was still expanding, and his ambitions were no longer confined to rail lines or profit margins. He was after something far greater, the control of America's arteries themselves. There comes a moment in every empire builder's life when power transcends profit, when control itself becomes the legacy. For Cornelius Vanderbilt, that moment arrived with the unification of the New York Central and Hudson River Railroads. It wasn't just a merger. It was the birth of a new national artery, an unbroken line of steel stretching from New York City to Chicago. A single seamless path binding the East Coast's financial might to the raw industrial muscle of the Midwest. Vanderbilt didn't simply own a railroad, he owned the flow of America. Every ton of coal, every bushel of grain, every factory shipment that passed along his rails paid silent tribute to his vision. Towns begged to be connected to his lines. Some offered land, others tax breaks, and many offered loyalty. They understood a simple truth: connection meant survival. Towns that welcomed Vanderbilt's rails flourished into bustling centers of trade. Those left off his maps withered into obscurity. That was his real power, the power to decide which places would live and which would die. It wasn't just business, it was nation-shaping. And Vanderbilt ruled it with the precision of a general and the confidence of a king. The genius of his strategy lay in its simplicity. He never wanted to merely participate in the system, he wanted to become the system. By controlling the arteries of commerce, he made every other form of power, political, financial, even moral, secondary. Banks needed his routes, farmers needed his tracks, factories depended on his timetables. His railroad wasn't a company anymore, it was infrastructure, the physical manifestation of American progress. To ride his trains was to move through the veins of an empire he had engineered from sheer will, and he knew it. Standing in his New York office, watching the smoke of his locomotives fade into the horizon, Vanderbilt must have understood that he had done something no man before him had achieved. He had made movement itself his domain. He had transformed ambition into architecture, vision into velocity. He had fused the power of industry with the pulse of a nation. In a world driven by men who sought fortune, Vanderbilt sought control. And now, as the trains thundered across his steel empire, he had achieved something greater than wealth. He had built the very framework of America itself. For all his victories, Cornelius Vanderbilt never conquered the one empire that mattered most, the human heart. The same relentless fire that fueled his rise also burned everything close to him. Behind the legend of the Commodore lay a man at war with himself. His business rivals feared him. His investors respected him, but his family lived in his shadow, trapped in the orbit of his ambition. Vanderbilt ruled his household like a corporation, measuring affection in performance, loyalty and profit. He divided his sons like chess pieces, testing them, pitting them against each other, watching who would survive. To him, weakness was a sin. But his obsession with control came with a devastating cost. His favorite son, George, the one he had seen as his true heir, fell ill and died young. It was the one loss Vanderbilt couldn't outthink, outfight, or buy his way around. For a man who had built an empire of motion, time itself seemed to stop. Those close to him said something inside him died that day. He became harder, colder, less trusting, retreating further into the armor of power. In his later years, the Commodore was surrounded not by family or friends, but by opportunists. Spiritualists whispered of messages from the beyond, promising him contact with his lost son. He paid them fortunes, desperate to bridge a gap money could not close. It was a cruel irony. The man who controlled the movement of millions now found himself motionless, trapped in a mansion filled with wealth but emptied of warmth. His empire had outlived his joy. Vanderbilt's story in those final years is a mirror for every person chasing greatness. The higher you climb, the thinner the air becomes. He had achieved what every man of his age dreamed of: dominion, respect, immortality, and commerce. Yet he lived his last years haunted, hollow, and suspicious of everyone around him. It's the paradox of absolute power, yet it demands everything and gives back nothing that truly matters. His life was proof that mastery over the world can cost you mastery over yourself. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe for more timeless lessons on how power truly flows, stories that reveal not just how empires are built, but the price their builders must pay. Because as Vanderbilt's life neared its end, one final question remained. What does a man do when there are no more worlds left to conquer? When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, America did not just lose a man, it lost the architect of a new economic order. Before him, wealth was inherited, tied to land, bloodlines, and tradition. After him, it became something forged, created through intelligence, audacity, and unrelenting will. Vanderbilt didn't simply amass riches, he redefined what power meant in a capitalist world. He showed that control over infrastructure, over the movement of goods, people, and money, was the ultimate form of dominance. In a nation still learning how to dream, he proved that vision, when fused with ruthlessness, could reshape destiny itself. He didn't invent ambition, but he weaponized it. From his ferries on the Staten Island shore to his empire of steel and steam, Vanderbilt embodied the raw, untamed force that would soon define America's greatest age. The Gilded Age, the era of Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Morgans, was born in his wake. They studied his methods, adopted his instincts, and built upon his blueprint. The term robber baron would come later, but the truth was more complex. Men like Vanderbilt weren't thieves. They were builders of a system so vast, so intertwined with the nation's progress, that it became impossible to separate greed from growth. His empire of rails and ships became the skeleton of modern America. Every track laid, every industry connected, every fortune made in his shadow was an echo of his vision. And yet the man himself remained something primal, half hero, half storm. His legacy was not gentle. It was forged in competition, aggression, and the unyielding belief that the world belongs to those willing to claim it. Near the end of his life, as his empire stretched from coast to coast, Vanderbilt was asked the question every titan eventually faces: what was the secret to your success? His reply was as cold as it was timeless: keep your money and keep your power. Simple, ruthless, eternal. Those words would become the creed of an entire generation of industrial kings. His story is not just history, it is a mirror. A reminder that progress always comes at a price, that creation and destruction are two sides of the same empire. Cornelius Vanderbilt built more than wealth. He built the psychology of American power. If these stories of vision, strategy, and dominance move you, subscribe now. Because the story of the titans who built our world isn't finished. It's still unfolding, every time someone, somewhere decides they will no longer ask for power, but take it.